Welcome. Thanks for coming to our Municipal Trends panel. My name is Gary Vogel. Thank you for joining us at MEREDA's 2025 Municipal Trends panel discussion. I'm an attorney at Drummond Woodsum and a MEREDA board member, and I'm moderating this discussion. With me on stage is Mark Adams, to my left, who's the president of Sebago Technics. Dan Stevenson, one more day with the city of Westbrook. And Dan, if people haven't heard, we can make the big announcement that he's taking on as the executive director of the Maine Regional Redevelopment Authority. Everybody knows it as MEREDA, so congratulations on that, Dan. And we also have Marty Groman, who is the mayor of the city of Westbrook. Excuse me.
Is that a promotion?
Biddeford. Of Biddeford, excuse me. So anyway.
Mayor of Westbrook is in the audience.
So anyway, our panel, and you can find our bios by scanning the QR code in the program. Programs are available at registration if you still need one. Our panel is going to examine impediments to development at the municipal level and what some municipalities are doing to support development, including steps to implement LD 2003, which was the big housing bill from a couple of years ago. The panel will take an in-depth look at MEREDA's 2024 legislation that was intended to give vested rights to developments based on the ordinances in effect at the time a completed permit is filed. If you were at the session where Elizabeth Frazier spoke, she talked a little bit about that. We'll go into it in a little more detail. And the panel will also preview some 2025 land use legislation. We're going to try to save a few minutes for questions at the end, so please save your questions for that time. So, let's see. There we go. So this just kind of addresses the things that we're going to be talking about, most of which I mentioned. And along with the last one, if we have time, municipal ordinance changes and practices to address climate change. The other thing, of course, you can't not mention is all the federal changes, which mostly affect funding, certainly affect development and municipalities, so we'll no doubt be touching on that as well. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who's going to talk a little bit about just some of what he sees as an engineering firm for some of the impediments to development at the municipal level, and then we'll all have an opportunity to join in on that.
Thanks, Gary. My job is, good afternoon. My job is to sort of set up some of the issues and trends that we see, and then as we talk with communities like Westbrook and Biddeford and other ideas of what we can do to address those and sort of make improvements on any concerning trends and issues that we're seeing. Sebago Technics works in dozens of municipalities every year, managing more than 1,200 projects annually. There are some very good cities and towns, such as Westbrook and Biddeford, who encourage and support development of all types. However, in general, we see several issues and trends that have made development in communities more challenging, costly, and time-consuming. Most of these trends are not the faults of municipalities. They're really reflective of larger issues, but they nonetheless affect our ability and impact our ability to experience growth and development in our communities and our state. So here's some of what we see. On the staffing side, there have been significant staffing shortages and turnovers in many municipalities, just as other industries. That's led to new personnel, and in the case particularly in planning and development, it's created sometimes a lack of experience and even sometimes a background in planning. They're recruiting folks from lots of different educations and backgrounds to help fill those needs and those holes. There's also an unfamiliarity often in the role and the rules that these people in these positions are having to now learn as they're engaging in their new positions. We sometimes see a lack of indecision or even inconsistency around some of this sort of learning as you go kind of thing. And then the natural tendency for people in new positions to sort of read the black and white, if you will, whether it's ordinances or otherwise, versus whatever sort of traditional interpretations and even precedents might be that we're all used to. Many municipalities and the DEP as well have moved to shorter work weeks or remote work. That has often led to some lack of availability, and then therefore sometimes causing sort of longer processing, if you will. And then on the planning board side, there's communities that struggle, not just with planning boards, but with other boards, to find volunteers for these positions. We sometimes forget on the very human side that these are volunteers in these roles. They're playing very critical and important roles in our development and growth, but they are volunteers. And when there is a lack of volunteers, we sometimes run into issues of quorums. That means sometimes things aren't able to be voted on, lengthening that process and time. And then also, obviously, if there's a lot of turnover in something like a planning board, there's again a lack of consistency and experience within that board.
And if I can just jump in here for a second, and I don't know if other people have encountered this, but if you have a quorum, but you barely have a quorum, sometimes you need every single person who's in attendance to vote to support the project, and it puts a developer in a real dilemma, knowing that they can't lose one vote if they're going to do that. So sometimes you have faced with a discussion about whether you're going to table and try to come back at the next meeting when there's a full complement, or when you hope there is. So all of those kinds of things create challenges.
It's something we have to sort of strategize all the time. Sometimes as consultants, we recommend that there be a tabling action rather than a vote, because there's concern of whether or not, obviously, you're going to get that majority that you need. When we talk about comprehensive plans and zonings, these days we often see conflicts between the comprehensive plan that a community has adopted, the goals that it has for development, and the zoning ordinances. And it sometimes leads to mixed messaging, right? We hear communities say they want business and development, but they sometimes, unintentionally perhaps, they make it confusing, sort of lengthy and expensive. Some of where we see this conflict and this inconsistency arise, we see literally an inconsistent application of the same language, sort of project to project. You can never write ordinances to apply to all situations, but obviously developers and consultants and others who are representing them are looking for that consistency or expecting it. We see sometimes interpretations or conditions that are well beyond the scope or intent of the original ordinance. And we see sometimes an incongruous response, like things that are permitted, are in the areas that communities want, still receive struggles, significant struggles to getting passed. And in short, we sometimes see communities say that they want growth, but the process, the implementation of the process or the community's needs, and then the reality for developers sometimes seem to the contrary.
That's quite a list, Mark. None of that is describing Biddeford.
Doesn't
right?
happen in Biddeford, I can tell you that. It's always one meeting and you're done in Biddeford.
So following up on one of the comments I made at the very start is, for Dan and Marty, are you seeing issues with funding on federal sources of funds and affecting municipal infrastructure projects or development? Any news on that front?
All what you've all been seeing, right? We've not experienced it into what we've all just most recently heard on the news. Prior to that, the funding had been available. We scored about $6 million in brownfields money through 3 different pots of money over the last, say, 18 months. Congressionally, delegated spending there. We still call them earmarks as older people in the room. You can be successful there, working with the congressional delegation. But I think the world is going to change for all of us, and what you've been relying on for federal funding from this point moving forward, be careful.
And I think, it's a tough balance. I've recently heard of some projects where things have to shift around. I mean, we're always in communication with the council, and there can be this feeling where these developers are just cashing in their money bags or something like that. But then the flip side is they're the ones taking all the risk. So if you have this, I do think it's going to become more of a problem. And I'm hearing from some developers like, well, I thought that was going to be, $330,000, and it turns out it's going to be $450 or something like that, or maybe add another zero to that. So I do see some challenges, but maybe particularly for projects with longer term financing horizons like the affordable projects.
And I just add, not directly related to funding, but I think just the amount of disruption and change businesses, developers, organizations are distracted, right? They're trying to keep up. They're trying to understand how it will affect them, and that alone can cause delays or pauses, if you will, in a project or some program that's trying to be put together.
So we've talked a little bit about some of the challenges. We'll take questions at the end. We've talked a little bit about some of the challenges, but Dan and Marty are from two communities that are really, very proactive in terms of trying to support development. So, how can developers, what are the features of a municipality that welcomes development? What should municipalities be doing to encourage development? We obviously know there's a huge housing shortage. Can you give us some examples of what's going on in Westbrook and Biddeford?
I'll go first, Marty. So the first thing you want to do is learn and understand and speak development language. If you don't do that, you're already behind the eight ball. The second thing is understand the real growth that you want in your community. Most of us in my role, we're street level practitioners. We don't sit, we put capital stacks together, right, with duct tape and poly. That's the only way to get deals done in this state, and to understand what these little pools of money are. So when someone comes in with a development project, i.e. we put a vertical growing facility in our downtown, you got to be open to that. You got to be open to changing your ordinances because it makes a lot of sense for payroll in the economy and growth of the tax base. You also have to spend time educating the elected officials. I can see right in the front row here, former Mayor Mike Foley's here, was also a former councilor, but he was instrumental at really supporting with the council on how we got to get these changes to grow our community. So it's elected officials, it's staff, it's moving forward with the ordinance changes. And one last piece I'll say is communities invest in yourself. All deals now require a subsidy. It's nearly impossible to get a deal across the finish line without it. And the more you can do at investing in, water, sewer, storm drainage, three-phase, roads, it sounds like an old parrot, but you can't expect the private sector to absorb that cost. The deal won't pencil. It's not a matter of them wanting to do it or not do it.
Although municipalities rely upon federal sources for a lot of that infrastructure funding.
We do. In Westbrook, I feel we're lucky enough that we try to stay on top of that. We have a grant writer on staff, but that's still hit or miss. And, you're always up against some other really good communities, and some of them in your own state.
I just underscore the infrastructure piece that in urban and suburban Maine, southern Maine, obviously in particular, most of the good sites have been developed. And good in this case is available and adequate infrastructure. And today, to Dan's point, the cost of infrastructure is higher than ever. Roads, power, water, sewer, stormwater, right? All those things are very expensive. And Dan called it penciling the deal. It just doesn't work for the economics if there isn't that investment by the community.
I would just double down on working and getting to know your elected officials. We had a project recently where the development team came in and met with myself and the council president, talked about the challenges that they had, but also what they were trying to achieve. That was one that has really moved through the steps in a nice way, and I would encourage people to find an opportunity to take those kind of steps. I've been somebody in my service as an elected official and as mayor, I like for the councilors to be, there's kind of two ways to do it. One is, here's the package, you better vote for it, or let's involve you early. And I'm more of a proponent of being involved early. I've seen much better results that way.
And one of the things that's mentioned on this slide is municipalities. Most municipalities of a certain size engage in comprehensive planning, but often they don't then go the next step of implementing the comprehensive plan by adopting the zoning changes. And that's really important because, especially now with the legislation that we're going to talk about a little bit, LD 772, if a developer can proceed as of right without having to seek zoning changes, it makes a huge difference in terms of being able to just go in, meet the rules, and do this rather than having to get sort of a discretionary and unappealable action by the council to get a zone change. So Dan, you've got a couple of slides here. Some of these things you might have covered, but
So the first one we have, invest in your community. Public-private partnerships are more important than they ever have. And just look at the bullet underneath it. Land use, make sure you're, be up to date with land use changes that you want. It's an ever-changing world. What types of land use mixes that work now weren't compatible years ago. So stay up on top of that. Work with your planning board and members of the community. Get the education out to make those changes. TIFs, I'll come back for 3 hours and talk about that this afternoon. For those who don't know about TIFs, that's another, but it's just one of the few financing tools that we have in the state of Maine. Times and schedules, right? You've all heard that saying, right? Time kills deals. Education is so important in the public participation process. And the more you can get out factual information to people and bring people together, then you can get deals across the finish line. Public infrastructure and amenities, people have heard me parrot this for years. The private sector invests in communities and invests in themselves. If you're just painting trash cans, right, and putting a couple plant boxes up, private sector's not showing up. They want to be welcome, but they also want to see that you're stepping up to the plate and investing in yourselves. I just put this image here quickly. This is called Westbrook Common. It's right in the center of our downtown. It was blighted and completely unused for decades. And, the community got together, and the council wanted it done, and we found $2 million to get it done. One thing about downtowns, if you have downtowns, below grade is really expensive. Everyone's just looking at that, but half the budget went to replace old water sewer lines. But guess what? You build capacity, and then you can grow more in the area. What's important about this space as we're trying to make Westbrook's downtown more destination-oriented is that in this particular space, see the buildings next to it, we then can work with the building owners to start getting higher and better uses, and they can command better leasing in their buildings, and then we can drive more of those uses in our downtown. It's a cumulative effect of everything we do. It's not just these one-trick ponies. And we can go to the next slide and about investing.
Before we do that, you want to just talk a little bit about some of the programs that go on in this space?
Yeah. So because partnerships are so important, right? So we have our Main Street Community Discover Downtown Westbrook. They partner and help us with a lot of different things, but one of them is programming. So at the corner of this project, there's a credit union, now Lighthouse Credit Union. And at the time when they were in Northeast, we literally just knocked on their door and said, would you give us $20,000 to program this space? And they said, of course we will. Why? Because we stepped up and invested in this space. If it would have been broken, the odds of getting that money were slim. So now people feel safer at night. We finally get the lights in there so we can do nighttime programming. And the program that they use in that space in the summertime is during daylight and evening hours, and it's literally from cradle to grave. They do a lot of different things in there, and we have all kinds of movable furniture. And we anticipate a lot more growth just in that space. And we have other spaces in there we've been investing as well, such as Valley Square. So here is maintain the highest level of certainty. How many people are bankers or developers, or I think you all are going to identify with this. Everything's about risk mitigation, right? Whether it's environmental, whether it's financial. Well, if a developer comes in and says, we're playing by the rules, so I'm just going to focus just for a moment on development projects. Those rules stay the same moving forward. They're saying, you guys, we're all playing by the rules, therefore that increases our likelihood of getting this project across the finish line. Because some of the things that we have to think about in the municipal level, and that I don't think it was quite the same years ago, things are moving really quickly, albeit COVID, you got to kind of take that out of the mix for a minute. Steel is on order. It's very expensive. Glass is on order. Concrete's ready to go. They're lining up, right? They're lining up all the contractors, and then something changes. It is a problem. It can shut a project down, and the last thing anybody wants to be is in court. So highest level of certainty, you build trust. Then the next time you do a deal, developers want to come back, engineers want to come back and say, we love working with Westbrook because they work with us. Good faith negotiation. It's a newer trend. When I first started, you guys remember the oldest negotiations went right, there was back and forth and you volleyed. Now, people come in on a handshake and say, do you want me in the community? This is what I'm willing to do. This is what I bring. And I'm going to show you my books. Here's our delta. Can you help me? Let's get this across the finish line. And together, let's be creative at getting projects across the finish line. That's done by consistent local policy and regular communication. It almost seems over painful, but trust me, it works. There are hiccups every day in projects. And then I already talked about risk mitigation, and that's not new to anybody in this room.
I just underscore, Gary, what Dan said, that, really those communities that really are supportive of development are those where people, process, and policy are in alignment. And the people part of that is obviously most important. There's a lot of people involved, and you described it. When the staff in a municipal community all coordinate and understand what the goals are, that makes everything, all those bumps that occur during the life of a project, go so much smoother than when there's sort of miscommunication or understanding.
The one thing here that I'm passionate about economic and community development, most people know that, but I am about policy as well. So I've been lucky when I worked years ago in the city of Biddeford and now certainly in the city of Westbrook with a very supportive mayor, also a very supportive council, where they let practitioners, us, help draft bills until they can become statute, and or testify in favor of or against policies or bills that are going to directly affect us. That's important because if there's any legislators, I saw Matt Pulley out here somewhere. Is he in this room? I see legislators come in here. Well, when you stand in front of a committee, you're not a hired gun, you're local staff. They'll listen into you because we're out there saying we're local practitioners. This is how this affects us. And also, if we can be involved in policy, and I strongly encourage anyone in municipal government to do so, your voice matters. And you can affect really good things. The one thing I think is so cool about the state of Maine is we're rural. Working a bill through the legislature seems like it's a difficult process. But once you go through it a few times, you can really help educate legislators. You can build community around things that make sense. My thing is policy changes. How are they going to affect what we do at the street level? That's why I think it's important that we stay involved in that. And so I'm hoping I see more local staff and or elected officials continue to do so.
So we're going to spend a couple of minutes talking about municipal implementation of LD 2003. This was really landmark legislation that was driven at the time a couple of years ago by our then and now current Speaker of the House, Ryan Fecteau, to really make a bunch of sweeping changes to Maine's land use laws that were intended to encourage residential development. And so the things that are in LD 2003, many of them are sort of self-executing, but some of them actually require municipal implementation or sort of opt-in for the municipality. There's provisions that provide for density bonuses, provided that the projects meet certain affordability requirements. There are requirements for zoning, as I said, zoning changes, but they in order to get these bills passed, like making most legislation, you have to make compromises. So the municipalities were able to provide exceptions and things like that that where they could, by ordinance, essentially allow or disallow some of these things. Other people are familiar with the ADU provisions that came out of this. I mean, I think that was a nice thing, but ADUs aren't going to solve the housing crisis. But there is a provision that allows 1 to 4 family units to be built on basically on any residential lot. So I know. I'm just going to turn back to Marty and Dan to see if you have any, experience with your communities in terms of what you're doing to, encourage housing development and maybe to implement some of the things from LD 2003.
We've been looking at a lot of changes. I mean, much of LD 2003 we had already in place. We had already ADUs, for example, since 2017. But I think it's been a really good nudge for us to, especially, we started with a couple of our town center zones to reduce setback requirements, reduce street frontage, and I think there's more afoot to do more of that. These are things that don't cost the city any money, and we can get more development. I've seen, for example, the back lot or flag lot provisions that we recently enacted already spur a few more homes, a chance to put another one. And it's not always what you think. And people are clever too. We've had to amend the ordinance a couple of times where people have sort of figured out where the loopholes are, but you'll see a new house in front of an old one or things like that. I see that as positive. I do think it's more to do, the ADUs are not a panacea by any means. They're kind of hard to build, and our restrictions around them as far as where the doors are and things like that. We recently held a housing forum, and that came up a lot. People identified just the arc of starting and finishing an ADU is unfamiliar to a lot of people, and I think we as a city need to make it easier.
Yeah, and I agree. We got ahead of the game. We had already had overlaid in our growth area to allow more units in the box in our growth area, mostly in our downtown. And then we allowed to go to what the state's minimum requirement was for size of units. It's a little under 400 square feet or something. So we adopted all of that. And we got 6 projects going just by making those 2 changes. But the city, we took the approach that this stuff's coming anyway, and we got ahead of the game, so we didn't have to I think we had to tweak the ADU piece. So one of the things, though, I do think that is important is that it can't just be land use changes. I do think sometimes you'll hear me say the things that are good for maybe Westbrook and Biddeford may not be good for Calais, Maine, or St. Agat up in the county. However, I think what's happening is we're trying to get land uses into places and spaces where density is okay, and it really makes sense to grow your growth area. It's okay to go up. One thing I'd like to add, though, is that it can't just be land use. The only way to subsidize rents, right, is to make it easier and smarter to get it done, but you got to buy down the cost of the project. You either need tax credits or cash in the deal. It just can't be the land use change. But I do think that is how we're going to get towards those 87,000 units. And I do think that as people become more engaged in it and say that it's okay, I'm used to living in high dense areas. I do now. I actually enjoy it. But the reality is we're driving at policies that I think are coming, and I just encourage communities to kind of step up and embrace this stuff.
Yeah, and Portland, many people are familiar with Portland's recode. Portland recently did a wholesale change in its zoning, and MEREDA is going to do a breakfast conference on March 20th. I see we've got Brandon Major here, who was the chair of the planning board during that. And so I think there's a further opportunity to come to a MEREDA breakfast conference and hear a lot about the changes that were done in Portland that are intended to, encourage residential development as of right under their ordinance. So Beth Frazier in the large session talked a little bit about this legislation LD 772 that MEREDA adopted last year. I frankly think this is really one of the most important pieces of land use legislation that's been adopted in Maine for a long time. It's intended to basically prohibit retroactive zoning changes for projects that are basically already coming to the planning board for development. I originally got involved in MEREDA because I was sort of outraged at some of the retroactive changes that could really pull the rug out from under developers way back in the 80s when we had the Fisherman's Wharf development in Portland, and nobody thought that would be legal, and it went to the law court, and sure enough, they said, yes, you can do it. If the intent is to make it retroactive and you state that, you can make it retroactive. And so MEREDA adopted some legislation 10 or 15 years ago that we worked on that was intended to deal with retroactive changes by referendum. But this one does it for any municipal changes. So basically, if a developer comes forward with a project and submits a completed application, then they essentially have vested rights to proceed under those rules. And if the municipality decides that they want to have a moratorium or change the project, or change the rules, if there's neighborhood opposition, they can change the rules prospectively. But for the project that filed under the existing ordinances, they can proceed under the rules that were in effect at that time. And that's really important. Most people don't realize that developers may have been working on these plans, spending literally hundreds of thousands of dollars on engineering and architectural plans and things like that before they even get to file their application at the planning board. So if you then go and change them and say, well, now you can't do this, it's really throwing out all of that investment and having to start over, assuming that a project would even work. And we, as I said, there's a case study. I think Marty and I were involved in really might have been the very first test of
On opposite sides.
of LD 772 on opposite sides. So my client filed we weren't doing a development permit so much, like coming before the planning board with site plan application, but we were seeking to do a condominium conversion for a large part of the Pepperell Mill in Biddeford. And some of the residents came to the city and complained. They were concerned that their rents were going to go up or they may not be able to afford these units. And, the city heard them and was responsive and enacted a moratorium. And I got the call that morning. It was like a dagger to my client's heart, because they had a mortgage that was maturing in a few months. They had, they needed to do this project. They had purchase and sale agreements for a commercial space that were going to be condominiums. And, how were we going to be able to deal with this? So we looked at this and said, well, LD 772 should apply because they had already filed their condominium conversion applications. So, like a lot of things, it wasn't quite as cut and dried as we would have liked because, for example, the city's moratorium was more expansive than the current ordinance that we applied under. The city's moratorium dealt with both commercial conversions and residential conversions, and the ordinance only dealt with residential conversions. But nevertheless, we said to the city, time out, you can't do this. And the city recognized that there were some, benefits for putting a lot more units on the market for housing units. And, we worked with the city, ultimately came up with a compromise. I'll let Marty talk about it a little bit from the city's perspective.
Yeah, this was a 4-stage condo conversion project, and it's a threatening term, I think, at least around Biddeford for no necessarily good reason, but people hear those two words together and they think, oh my gosh. So there actually are great opportunities for ownership in many of these, but that wasn't always perceived. So this consumed most of my fall. I missed out on hunting season, but I think it was useful that the certainty of the state law did exist, and it basically allowed us to work with this developer in I think, a good faith way and bring the total package of not just the initial condo conversion, which was clearly protected by LD 772, but the remaining ones. And I think could be argued kind of a win-win. I don't know if your client would say that, Gary, but I was largely pleased with how it came out.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they would have not had to prefer to go through that exercise, but they had some. They certainly wanted to get over this hurdle. Had we not been able to do it, it would have killed the entire project. I mean, we had, a buyer who was buying commercial units, but they were also buying commercial condominiums, and so we couldn't have created the condominiums, and refinance them unless we could do that. And so my clients certainly were willing to, to come to the table and give some more, but which basically meant, providing some more benefits for some of the existing residents, whether it be, more notice, some more sort of relocation, some protection for their existing tenancies and things like that. And so I would say that, it ultimately it was a win-win. And that's the first instance I'm aware of, where LD 772 was used. But, the things that brought it to, MEREDA, Beth Frazier talked about the 900-unit project in Kittery, that basically got killed. And, we had a client that came forward in Brunswick with a project to develop about 400 housing units, very, moderate priced housing units and they were in a spot that was zoned for, growth and development and everything else. They were exactly fit under the ordinance, and the municipality, that some of the neighbors didn't like it, and they were able to convince the town council to do a moratorium because they felt that it didn't have enough affordable housing. And so they said, well, if you create 30% of it as affordable, then you can have you can proceed. And my client said, okay, we can make that work. And so they resubmitted their plan to be 30% affordable. And lo and behold, the neighbors came in and said, well, it's going to harm the water in McCoy Bay. And so there was a second moratorium. And ultimately, the project failed. They got the town to buy the land back. But these were the kinds of things that LD 772 was intended to, prohibit. The municipality had gone and zoned this land, was across from the high school to be where dense development was going to be encouraged in Brunswick. But, when it actually hit, there was a lot of outcry. And that's why I say it's really important to have municipalities zone to incorporate the provisions of their comprehensive plan so that you can proceed as of right, so that you're not having to ask for changes. So if you can submit a completed application, you get the protection against moratoria or rezoning that would be retroactive.
Yeah, this is me, I think. This is my chance to take a little bit of a victory lap on some of the development that we're have underway in Biddeford. And I maybe use that term a little too strongly, but we've got a lot of good things going on. I'm really proud of it. This adds up to, almost, more than 2,000 units hitting the housing market coming up in the next 2 or 3 years. We only have about 10,000-ish units in Biddeford, so we're a city of just under 23,000, I think, the sixth largest in Maine. But 12th straight year of enrollment growth in the schools, and it's feeding this in a good way. And the real key point I wanted to make here is what we're seeing is that the affordable projects are complementing the market rate projects. So if you know Biddeford at all, the new parking garage is kind of a political football. The mayor needs to really do something about that. But anyway,
Talk to him.
we have new projects, including from developing teams that are here, like Westbrook Development Corporation and Fathom Companies, and they're working together. So an affordable element from Westbrook Development Corporation is helping Fathom Companies get to the finish line as far as making their project pencil out. So I'm super proud of that. And next, I want to show you a slide that I think is the most important thing that you're going to see today. So I think this is my big takeaway for you. The everything bagel, okay? Now, I think that's what helps us here in Biddeford, or maybe some of the rest of you will weigh in on this, but what I've pushed with the council and certainly realized myself is these projects cannot be all things to all people, right? You have to get 80% of what you want to get these projects to the finish line. You can't have everything on one of these projects. You can't overload a project with requirements if it's different elements that you would love to bring to every project. But at some point, you just got to say, this is going to work, council. This is going to work, mayor. We can't push it off the edge of the table. And I think us being ready to think about that in Biddeford and some things we maybe learned the hard way have really helped us get more than 2,000 units underway. So thanks for indulging my little gambit there.
All right, everybody seen the everything bagel. The next slide is going to be the schmears and the toppings. So a little bit of a preview before we get into the question and answer of some upcoming legislation that's before the legislature. This is going to be a very active session for housing, very much like the last couple of years were. Not going to talk about bills in any kind of detail. Many of them, we don't even have the bill text yet. Sometimes they're just bill titles. But these are kinds of things that MEREDA, is working on at the legislative process. You may be getting emails from MEREDA saying, please, write your state legislature and help support or help defeat, some of these things. So I wanted to talk about, approaches to combat NIMBYism. This is one of the most challenging things. I mean, even to legislate and to deal with. Very difficult. When people come to a planning board, the folks who are fine with the project, they just feel like they could stay home because they don't, they're good with it. And so, you end up with really a disproportionate group of people often that don't represent necessarily the community, the broad, community support that a project may have when we're talking about NIMBYism. So there are some bills, or at least one bill, that seeks to have an appeals panel patterned after some legislation that was adopted in New Hampshire that's working there. So we'll be looking for that, and I'm sure talking about that some more. Changes to Maine subdivision laws. So you might have heard Beth Frazier talk about this morning. Under LD 2003, you can put in a 1 to 4 family project as of right. However, Maine has an unusual subdivision law in that we treat dwelling units as lots for purposes of subdivision. So if you want to put a 3-unit or a 4-unit building on your property, you can only actually create 2 units on a lot in any 5-year period without triggering subdivision review and having to submit all of the things that requires. And that can be very costly, and frankly, you probably have to seek, a dozen different waivers of things because the subdivision law was really drafted to address sort of the traditional neighborhood subdivision with streets and stormwater and everything else. And we're talking about a lot that has a 4-unit building on it. So there are some changes to the subdivision laws that are occurring both at the DEP level for the site location law and for municipal level. Changes to building and housing codes. I mean, this is, I think, really important for multifamily development and affordable housing. Not every project necessarily needs, if it's sprinklered, and new construction is always going to be sprinklered for multifamily, doesn't necessarily need 2 means of egress and all of the different window requirements and things like that add a tremendous amount of cost. So we're looking at many of those kinds of changes, and obviously another one is climate resiliency. I mean, I think this is a really big topic, and that everybody's sort of dealing with. And I don't know if any of you want to mention anything about that, of what you're seeing in terms of changes.
It's definitely a huge issue, right? It's accelerated just from last January and the storms that we saw immensely just in the last couple of years. And while I'm not aware of huge efforts at local levels for new ordinances, there are certainly some and so forth. Pay attention to what's going on at the DEP and other agencies. They are definitely starting to take a very active sort of update and position on this. And from our perspective, representing property owners and coastal businesses, waterfront businesses, there's going to be impacts. There's going to be major restrictions that are going to prevent people from either being able to protect their property or continue to use it in the fashion that they've always been accustomed to. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
I'd just add, it's not just coastal communities. I think right now, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen at the federal level, but what the trend was for the longest time is if you're not dealing with climate change, you have resiliency plans, federal funding is going to be tied to that if you want to go out and leverage that dollar. So I would take it serious. It's real.
So we have time for a few questions. And if somebody has a question, they should please come up to the microphone. It's right in the center aisle there. No, go to the microphone. We're recording this. So people are, there's all these concurrent sessions. So I want to make a plug for this. So if you're really interested in the financing session, but you're here today and you'd really like to hear what they're doing, MEREDA's recording these and putting them on, so you can go in, I'm sure it'll be a few days, but everyone who attended is going to be able to, go and review, each of the sessions, whether you, participated, attended them or not. So anyway, go ahead with your question.
Well, first of all, I wanted to speak to the praises of the Everything Bagel. And in Marty's town, they have a Rover Bagel, which really changed my life. So I want to thank, the potential for Biddeford bringing in Rover Bagel and keeping it. I'm an attorney getting my CLE here today, and so far it's been the best CLE I've been to in a long time. Really good use of time and very interesting speakers.
And one of the best bargains too, frankly.
Yes, I know, and here it is, my last year of practice. It takes a while. But I spent 40 years being a municipal attorney and 40 years being in every planning board in York County. And it is such a dysfunction. It is such a dysfunction to place people's property rights in the hands of lay people. And when you talk about NIMBYism and you talk about any amount of neighbors that show up at a meeting, it becomes the Wild West. And, even though my firm has done well because we represent people and get paid to sit around for 5 hours on a night, which is nice billable time, it's so inefficient and it's so wrong. But, most of my life, I really believed that it was never going to change. Because how do you ever roll back regulations? People love regulations, When I started practicing, there was one town planner in the town of Kennebunk. Now there's the staff of the planning department is huge. But so, and it's so great to hear, MEREDA taking a real proactive approach because this really is what's needed. And I think this is a really unique opportunity to maybe make some inroads in changing the matrix of how we do things. And I think we really need to get it out of the hands of planning boards. If towns are going to pay for a professional planner and they're going to, take Sebago Technic's work and have it, peer engineered, there's not a lot for a planning board to weigh in on. So what they weigh in on is some nuances just because they feel like they want to do a good job and they want to appease the people that are in front of them that they might see in the shop and save. So they want to just kind of show they're fighting the fight. And God forbid an attorney ever, shows up, then everybody wants to fight, It's terrible. So I hope that in the context of trying to figure out a way to make affordable, that we really start to think of a different paradigm. It should be professionally reviewed by the town planner, peer reviewed by the town engineer, boom, approved. Doesn't need 9 meetings, doesn't need public hearings, doesn't need sketch plan, doesn't need preliminary plan. Look at this guy's head's gonna go flying. Because I work with your guys, they're great. And they get in front of, the planning boards and they do a great job, but it's so inane, it's so insane. If you haven't been to these meetings, go to them. I don't know why you would want to choose to go to them. But they're dreadful, and it's not a way to determine property rights. So, good luck.
I love everything you're saying. Is there a question in there?
Did I have to ask a question?
We have to go. This is
you
like
don't.
the countdown. We got 60 seconds before we're changing over.
What do you guys think about, a different...
I, of course, would just underscore all of your comments. And Dan mentioned it earlier, and embedded in your comments is trust, right? Trust in the process, but trust in the professionals. Whether they be certainly firms like ours. We, like you, benefit. The longer it takes, the more hours we charge. But that's not what it's about. It shouldn't be what it's about. And the trust in the staff, where we see communities where they've trusted the staff, they've given them approval and authority at certain thresholds, right, for things that are in compliance, if you will, with ordinances and other rules, that's where it works really, really well. And those communities move forward.
One of the things I often see, though, is that planning boards often have the opportunity to take stuff back that was, that the staff had the authority to do, unless the planning board says, we'd like to review this. And unfortunately, you see a bunch of NIMBYs to come in, and then all of a sudden the planning board decides, well, maybe we should take this and review this, and now it just, all the good ideas of having it be staff review are by the boards, and now we're back into the whole, the whole process. So Unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions. I do want to thank everyone for joining us today. You have about 10 minutes before your next session begins at 2 o'clock. And let's keep these conversations going and have a great afternoon. Thanks.